Climate change is caused by burning of fossil fuels that release greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. The greenhouse effect is caused by molecules in the Earth's atmosphere. Some examples are water, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane, keeping heat from escaping the Earth's atmosphere. That heat in the form of light can escape the atmosphere because it's reflected off of the Earth's surface. However, the majority of heat that isn't in the form of light can't escape the atmosphere because it's absorbed by gases. Adding more greenhouse gases to the atmosphere increases the amount of heat that is kept, resulting in increased temperature. The effects of climate change are impacting every part of our world. It becomes more extreme when the temperature is higher and results in more extreme, major storms, floods caused by rising sea levels in coastal regions, snowfall, and longer and more frequent droughts. In the oceans, ice is melting due to the fact that global temperature has risen. Melted ice is water that causes sea levels to rise. The sea level has risen 7 inches over the last 100 years, and it is now at a constant rate of 3.2 millimeters per year. Climate change also affects the food we grow because growing crops becomes difficult during droughts. This is a very serious issue because 70% of the world food supply is grown on farms. This puts most of the available food at risk and could be a crisis if not faced. Another issue climate change poses on us is a threat to our health. Smog increases in urban areas due to the greenhouse effect. Smog contains high concentrations of ozone, which causes asthma, heart disease, and lung cancer. In 1861, Irish physicist John Tyndall shows that water vapor and certain other gases create the greenhouse effect. In 1896, a Swedish chemist concludes that industrial-age coal burning will enhance the natural greenhouse effect. His conclusions on the likely size of man-made greenhouse are in the same ballpark, a few degrees Celsius for a doubling of CO2, as modern-day climate models. In 1938, a British scientist uses records from 147 weather stations around the world and shows that temperatures have risen over the previous century. In 1938, British scientist Guy Callendar shows that global temperatures have risen over the previous century using records from 147 weather stations. Using a new generation of equipment, including early computers, U.S. researcher Gilbert Plass analyzes in detail the infrared absorption of various gases. He concludes that doubling CO2 concentrations would increase temperatures by 3 to 4 degrees Celsius. In 1957, U.S. oceanographer Roger Revelle and chemist Hans Suess show that seawater will not absorb the additional CO2 entering the atmosphere, as many had assumed. In 1965, a U.S. President's Advisory Committee panel warns that the greenhouse effect is a matter of real concern. In 1972, the first UN Environmental Conference is held in Stockholm, Sweden. Climate change hardly registers on the agenda, which centers on issues such as chemical pollution, atomic bomb testing, and whaling. The United Nations Environment Program is formed as a result. U.S. scientist Wallace Broecker puts the term global warming into the public domain in the title of a scientific paper. In 1988, the International Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, formed to collate and assess evidence on climate change. In 1989, carbon emissions from fossil fuel burning and industry reached 6 billion tons per year. In 1990, the IPCC produces first assessment report. It concludes that temperatures have risen by 0.03 to 0.06 degrees Celsius over the last century. The assessment also concludes that adding man-made emissions to the natural gases in the atmosphere would result in global warming. In 1995, the IPCC second assessment report concludes that the balance of evidence suggests a discernible human influence on the Earth's climate. This has been called the first definitive statement that humans are responsible for global warming and climate change. In 1997, the Kyoto Protocol is agreed on. Developed nations pledged to reduce emissions by an average of 5% in the period of 2008 to 2012, with wide variations on targets for individual countries. In 2001, the IPCC Third Assessment Report finds new and stronger evidence that man-made emissions of greenhouse gases are the main cause of global warming in the second half of the 20th century. In 2006, carbon emissions from fossil fuel burning and industry reach 8 billion tons per year. In 2007, the IPCC's Fourth Assessment Report concludes that it is 90% likely that man-made emissions and greenhouse gases are responsible for modern-day climate change. In 2013, the first part of the IPCC's fifth assessment report says that scientists are 95% certain that humans are the dominant cause of global warming since the 1950s. In 2015, 195 nations agreed to combat climate change and signed the historical Paris Agreement. They decided to unleash actions and invest towards a low-carbon, resilient, and sustainable future. The best way to slow the effects of climate change is to lower greenhouse gas emissions. More effective legislation and guidelines are necessary and need to be followed in order to regulate what is going into our atmosphere to save the condition of our planet. Overall, we need to reduce carbon emissions by at least 45% in order to reverse some of the damage that we've done to our planet. We also need to use 85% renewable energy and stop using coal entirely in order to make sure that we have renewable energy that can be sustainable for years. An additional step we need to take is to plant more trees in order to absorb all the excess carbon in the atmosphere. June 1st of 2017, the United States pulls out of the Paris Agreement, which requires all parties to put forward their best efforts through nationally determined contributions. This means that the United States is no longer nationally obligated to any promises about cutting back on carbon emissions. The carbon fee and dividend policy is currently a bill in Congress that puts a plan to help cut the United States CO2 emissions, possibly by 50% in the next 20 years. The fee will put a tax on carbon emissions, which will be an incentive to make companies lower the amount of greenhouse gas they produce. One of the best ways you can fight against climate change is to reduce, reuse, and recycle. Another thing to do is to turn off the things you aren't using. Saving energy will cut down on carbon emissions. Also, drive less and drive smart. Driving less and carpooling cuts down on emissions and can save fuel. Another way to travel smart is to take public transportation. Buy energy-efficient products. Using products that waste less energy than others limits CO2 emissions. Lastly, plant a tree. Trees clean the air by absorbing CO2 emissions that can limit the effects of climate change.